Hi, this is Scott from Heretical Sraffa. Today I'd like to go through a pretty long PowerPoint presentation or a slideshow presentation that I've made. This slideshow is available under the dialog box. This is going to take, I've broken this down into five video lectures. I know it's a lot of video lectures, but for one PowerPoint, but there are a lot of ideas that I'd like to convey here. I think that one of the most important things that that I wish to convey, generally speaking, in terms of all these lectures that I'm doing and will be uploading as well, new versions of, is to demonstrate to people, to professional economists as well as lay people, and especially younger people, that economic inquiry is not a settled question. Okay, it's not a settled matter at all. And quite frankly, I think that there's a lot of intellectual dishonesty that's associated with academic economics and academic economics departments, especially some of the mainstream economics departments. That you look at the Harvards and the Yales, the Chicagos, and the Berkeleys and the Stanfords, and all these different departments that that profess and propel the myth, quite frankly, that economic theory is a settled question when in fact it's not. And that's really problematic because the way in which this is done, the way in which this is able to get away with, is by conflating their particular, or what we'll see as a neoclassical approach, conflating the neoclassical approach to the question of what economics needs to answer. They conflate that with economics as such. And one of the things that you're going to get, hopefully, get out of the lectures that I'm going to be developing here is the notion that no, it's not the only way we can conceive of economics. It is a way, and of course, you know, people have a right to develop their theoretical models, etc. I agree with that, and let's, you know, but what people don't have a right to do is to make the erroneous claim that that's the only way in which we can conceive of the matter. And that's, I think, the big question that we need to see here, is that when you look at economics from the way in which I'm going to develop it here in this PowerPoint or in this slideshow, is that these two different approaches to the question look at the economy in two entirely different ways. It's like me and a neoclassical economist, we're not even talking about the same thing oftentimes. I mean, for me, economics is not a decision-making enterprise. It's not a science where individuals are optimizing their utility and firms are optimizing their profitability subject to the constraint. It's not a science only about choices and the ubiquity of scarcity. No, 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 no. That's one approach, okay? And there is, in fact, another approach to economics, is what we refer to here in the slideshows as classical political economy, that has no need for any of this neoclassical baggage. Now, the way I'm going to present it here is going to be very simple, very, you know, thumbnail. Don't listen to me. That's the other thing. You know, go explore for yourself. I'm going to give you all the different tools that the way I see it, and in order to find these things, I'm going to tell you the way that I look at it. But by all means, people should read for themselves, especially the young generation, and not to reproduce the dysfunction of my generation and older, who, in my estimation, again, in my opinion, have failed. I think that economics as a discipline has failed, and I think that we need to be honest about that as economists, and not just, you know, just say that no, we've not failed. We failed, and I think that some of the reasons why, I hope, become apparent as we develop this. So we begin here on what was referred to as the rehabilitation of classical political economy. This is an endeavor that was developed by Sraffa in the 1960s, and by the capital controversies that happened with Joan Robinson, etc., in the 1950s, that go back to some of the questions that J.B. Clark and Bombaverk and Veblen were debating in the 19-teens, in the 19-aughts, if you will, or the knots or whatever. So, and carried on from the 1890s, etc. I mean, these questions have been that Keynes brought up with the general theory. These questions have been have been asked many times over the span of economic thought, the history of economic thought, and again, it ain't just a settled question. And I think that the public and young economists especially should demand accountability on the part of their faculty and the part of faculty of these mainstream schools to demand a diversity. Diversity is, part of diversity is going to be gender and race and ethnicity and other such things. And another part of diversity needs to include a diversity of perspective. And I think that by creating space for the heterodoxy to be, you know, once again brought up to the legitimacy of the mainstream and thereby hired in different departments and requiring these different academic departments to address issues that are on the heterodoxy, I think is an important development that needs to happen with academic economics especially. And the only way that's going to happen is if there's pressure by the public to do so, quite frankly, because the economists, the arrogance of the academic professorate is generally true anyway, right? I mean, you know, there's a lot of arrogance, a lot of ego out there. But with physics, you have the ego, but you can't make up a theory of gravity, right? Economics, forget about it. It is wide open, okay? And then you have relations of power, which determine the particular scientific merit of the endeavor. It's just a whole mess, in my opinion. And again, you know, people may see it differently, which is fine. It's a free world here. We can have different ways to think, and this is just a particular way that I think. Take with it whatever you can, but do something and understand, at least listen to this different perspective. So this is the rehabilitation of classical political economy inspired by this work. And so what we want to do is we want to begin this, okay? Right. The approach taken here develops the theory of value and distribution of classical political economy, or CPE, in terms of advances made by Piero Sraffa as discerned by the present writer. This is my discernment here. I'm given this particular perspective. Again, don't take my word for it. Explore these matters yourself. The frame of reference takes a non-linear, I think a bifurcated view of the history of economic thought in the development of the theory of value and distribution. Here we introduce two different elements of economic theory. The first being that it's a theory of value and distribution. They're co-equal theoretical conceptions that must be explained by any economic theory. Value and distribution, right? And it's a very important point in this particular approach. Theory of value is going to be a theory which explains the generalized exchange between heterogeneous goods in the market economies, right? One of the things we see in market economies is the generalized nature of the exchange relation, that everything has a price, everything has a value. That did not happen with non-market societies. Yes, there was money in non-market societies. Yes, Aristotle speaks about money and writes about money. Yes, Marx, among others, talks about Aristotle doing it. Yes, the ancient Chinese had paper money, but the difference between money as such and a market society is the fact that in these pre-market societies, in these ancient societies, including up to feudalism, etc., the market mechanism was not the primary way in which the goods and services, or the use values, as Marx would call it, were produced and distributed in the social milieu. That happens with the market mechanism in market societies, where now in market societies, everything, production, distribution, everything is winnowed through that market mechanism. That's the difference. Now, in order for that to happen, we have to have what is observed is the when that happens, I should say, what is observed is the fact that these different quantities of different things exchange in some regularized way. And what then has to become relevant is an explanation of how. All right, so we say here, theory of value, a theory which explains the generalized exchange between heterogeneous goods and market economies. The theory of value is taken as the basis of what underlines the theory of money and the different approaches. So all approaches are going to have a theory of value. All approaches are ergo going to have a theory of money. This is a general idea. Move to the theory of distribution. Theory of distribution is a theory which explains the distribution of revenue from the value added in an economic system. The theory of distribution considers the mechanisms underlying the accrual of different streams of revenue to the agents in an economic system. So I'm keeping it very general here. Yes, we're going to approach on CPE, but generally speaking, for both classical political economy and neoclassical marginal economics, and all the variety of different theories that we can locate under each of these broad categories, that both of these approaches has to have a theory of value and has to have a theory of distribution, okay, defined according to that. The two broadly conceived theoretical perspectives that we use to explain this are going to be classical political economy and neoclassical marginal economics. So, we begin with the objective phenomenon observed in market societies. And that's simply the following: that in a regularized exchange relationship, what we observe is that one unit of one good, or different quantities of different goods, exchange for the same value, or command the same value, or command the same price. The way I've explained it here, it says that 1 unit of X1 is going to cost $1 or exchange for $1 in the market, and 2 units of X2 are going to be worth or exchange or command $1 in the market. Now that's the phenomenon that we observe. So with that, we can arrive at the unit price of the good. Okay, if $1 fetches 1 unit of good 1, that means that the unit price, dollar per unit, is going to be equal to $1 per unit good 1. If 2 units of good 2 are going to cost $1, or they command $1 in the market, that means that if 2 is for $1, that means every 1 unit of good 2 is going to be a half a dollar. Now, one thing you'll notice here is how I put my dollar signs in the units on the back of the numbers. I do that because that way we can be very clear as to the dimensions of the quantities and the concepts that we're using. One of the problems that I have with economic theory generally, and this is for orthodox as well as heterodox economics, quite frankly, is the fact that oftentimes numbers and categories and concepts that are supposed to be a certain quantity are left unspecified. We're supposed to understand that there's a certain quantity that's associated with those numbers, but it's not really clear what that is. And I try to avoid that by putting the numbers and the units behind, the units and the dimensions behind the numbers, so that you can cancel them out just like you would in your chemistry lab, right? You can then cancel and get the appropriate units. And I think, at least for me, lends a significant degree of clarity to the subject matter, right? So getting the middleman out, quote unquote, was that, well, 1 unit of good X1 exchanges for $1, 2 units of good X2 exchange for $1. Well, that means for whatever reason, 1 unit of good X1 is going to be equal in value to 2 units of good X2. And the question is, why? Why on earth would we have a regular exchange relation such that 1 unit of X1 exchanges for 2 units of X2? Now, this is what economic theory has to try to answer, among other things, right? This is one of the things that economic theory has to try to answer. One of the most important things, I would argue, that economic theory tries to answer, the theory of value. So what we have here are 2 different theoretical approaches that try to answer the same question. Now, the question is, what is it about these different quantities of different things that render them commensurate or render them equal such that in the market these different quantities fetch the same dollar? Classical political economy explains the matter by focusing the relations on the production time necessary for the creation or the production of these different quantities of these different things. And so here we have what we refer to as the labor theory of value. Now, we're going to keep labor theory of value very general in this context and just refer to the cost of production. Even that needed the general put in quotation marks, because a lot of these terms are really loaded. So I'm just keeping things as very innocuous as I can at the beginning. We'll come back and explore all these different relations, but I'm trying to keep it as innocuous as I can in these initial first presentations, because this is very important for us to move forward. Here, the labor theory of value is conceived as the way in which we can explain how these different quantities exchange for different different things. This begins with Adam Smith. Adam Smith in Book 1 of The Wealth of Nations in Chapter 6, a chapter called of the Component Prices of Commodities, introduces a simple labor theory of value, which he'll then reject. I mean, that is true. So in looking at Smith, you have to see that Smith is contradictory in many of his in many of the things he says. And don't give the guy credit, right? I mean, he's writing in 1776, brilliant thinker, developing insights into the market mechanism. But in Chapter 6, Book 1, he does speak about the simple labor theory of value, and there talks about the beaver and deer hunters, and at the same amount of labor time it takes to kill 2 beaver as 1 deer, then there's going to be an exchange relationship there, or 1 beaver and 2 deer, I forget. I'll put a lesson on Smith up. I have a nice little handout and lesson that I teach my students that I'll put up there for you guys as well, specifically on the idea of the early en route state and the simple labor theory of value and Smith's subsequent rejection. However, for our purposes here, we see that in classical political economy, the basis of commensuration is going to be in labor time it takes to produce. It takes, on average, the same quantity of labor time to produce 1 unit of X1 as it does to produce 2 units of X2. So goes this approach. Commensuration, i.e. equality of these different things, right? Commensuration is based in equal quantities of labor time necessary for production, and an important element of this theory of value is that it is an objective theory of value. That means that the subjective preference relations don't matter in the determination of the exchange relation, at least on this supply, quote-unquote, the supply side story here, right? That the utility function is not going to be here. It doesn't matter if you like it or not. What is important are the commensurate labor times it takes to produce it, okay? Labor theory of value, temporally the earlier theory of value, beginning around Smith, a little bit earlier, we can trace it up until 1870. And 1870 is an important year because that was right after Marx published his book, and we'll talk more about that in a slide coming up. Neoclassical marginalist economics is historically the later theory. It comes around 1870. The myth and the idyllic myth of the marginalist revolution, where 3 independent thinkers, Walras in France, Menger in Austria, and Jevons in England, they just had this epiphany and they saw this thing. It's really not the way it happened. I will encourage you to read Sraffa's lecture notes on the advanced theory of value, which are now available. I'll also put that up under the dialogue box for people, and you'll see that the epiphany of the marginalist revolution is a little far-fetched, and that there is actually concrete reasons why the labor theory of value became dangerous, and it had to do with the specter of Marx. I'll talk about that in a little bit here. Okay. For our purposes here, however, neoclassical marginalist economics has to explain the same phenomenon. All right, so let's see how do they explain it. Well, they have to explain. We see that 1 unit of good X1 is going to exchange for 2 units of good X2, and then the answer that these guys propose is going to be that of subjective utility and consumption. The individual, that's the utility maximizing rational individual, or the individual that engages in what we call quote-unquote purposeful behavior. These are the language that you'll see especially in neoclassical principles texts. That the individual receives, according to this approach, the individual receives on average the same quantity of utility when consuming 1 unit of X1 as he/she does when consuming 2 units of X2. Again, whatever I may think of the basis of commensuration, I think it's relatively ridiculous, quite frankly, but the point is it does explain the question. You answer the question. We have to explain 1 unit of X1 is equal in value to 2 units of X2. We know that because we have the same amount of money of fetching each of these different quantities of these different things. For the marginalist economic, and I should say that this is going to be this is going to be utility at the margin of constrained choice. I'll explain that in another lesson where I go through and give a simple explanation of constraint optimization, a simple consumer behavior problem. But for our purposes here, understand that there is that caveat that you have equal utility at the margin of constrained choice. Commensuration for the neoclassical marginalist economic approach is going to be based on equal quantities of utility received in consumption. Here, the measure of value is subjective. So note the distinction. Again, I'm not all, not everybody accepts this. So again, read for yourself this approach. But already, and you can see, and I should say there are those that do accept this, however, and I encourage you to read Sraffa on his lecture notes in the Advanced Theory of Value for this particular perspective. But in any event, the way I'm setting it up here, you can see that what we mean by the economy is two different things from the outset, man. From the get-go, we're talking about two entirely different things. And that's a big problem. I think Keynes had to deal with when in 1936, he's trying to develop an economic theory that can have a better explanation for the reality of the Great Depression that the marginalist demand and supply approach was not able to do. So he invented macroeconomics, which in my estimation harkens back to a lot of the conceptual categories that were spoken about with the classicals, right? And anyway, we'll talk more about that as we go. So you see how we're setting up the story, okay? So now we're going to come back to this objective phenomenon. We're going to break this down a little bit more deeply, okay? Already we saw, let me come back before I do that. You can see that we have our price, right? Here is going to be the money price of good 1, and here is going to be the money price of good 2. Now what we're going to do is we're going to explore the value relations behind that in this simple thumbnail sketch, okay? So the objective phenomenon observed is going to be 1 unit of X1 exchanges for 2 units of X2. On the left-hand side of your screen is going to be the labor theory of value, where the commensuration of these different quantities of these different things is going to be based in the labor time it takes to produce it. Here I normalize it to 1 unit of labor. So this says that 1 unit of X1 is produced in 1 unit of abstract, socially necessary labor time, right? And 2 units of X2 is produced in abstract, socially necessary labor time. Again, taking that notion, that definition from Marx. But in any event, you see that the commensuration is going to be based on labor time. On the right-hand side of your screen is going to be the utility relation. Here we speak of quantities of utility or streams of utility. This is referred to as cardinal utility, where cardinal utility is going to be the earlier way in which utility was conceived by the so-called marginalist revolutionaries, Menger, Jevons, and Walras. Cardinal utility is going to be utility relations where the satisfaction units can be added and subtracted and multiplied, etc. Most economic theories do not accept cardinal utility. They have advanced. I think it's a little bit of a sleight of hand, but I'll do another presentation about that, by the way, the whole problem about it. But they reject the cardinal utility notion, and they advance an ordinal utility notion where it's not the quantity of utility that matters, but rather the ranking of the preferences that matters. And then you can have an ordinal structure, and this is where you're getting a lot of set theory in terms of modern microeconomics, because you're not dealing with a value relation anymore. It's a physical bundle relation of preferences, and you have these axiom of preferences that are going to allow you to draw a well-behaved utility function where you have convex preferences. I keep drawing that because that's going to be your indifference curve. I'll come back to that, and I'll present a lesson on that. But for our purposes here, we're sticking with cardinal utility because I think it illustrates well the point that I'm trying to make. So on the right-hand side is your utility theory of value. This says, according to that approach, 1 unit of good X1 is going to give you the same satisfaction as 2 units of X2. This is this idea of equal quantities, of equal quantities of utility associated with different commodities is the basis of the indifference curve, the thing I was drawing in space there. The indifference curve, instead of just the single commodities, the indifference curve is usually considered as a bundle of commodities. And what an indifference curve says is that different bundles of commodities yield in cardinal utility yield the same utility. In ordinal utility, these different bundles are equally preferred. Right? But in any event, you have this utility relation and you have this indifference relation, and the point on the right-hand side is the focus on consumption. So we have unit values for both, right? Again, what we're trying to do is develop the value form to the money form. We have unit values of both. We're going to have the unit labor values and the unit utility values. Unit labor value is going to be the labor time divided by the quantity of the output. Unit utility values is going to be the utility derived divided by the quantity of the output. Lambda is going to be, the Greek letter lambda is going to be associated with the labor value. This says here, if 1 unit of good 1 is produced in 1 abstract hour of labor, then the labor value of good 1 is going to be 1 hour per unit good 1, or 1 unit labor per unit good 1. If 2 units of good 2 are produced in 1 hour of labor, then the labor time it takes to produce good 2 is going to be 1 unit of labor for every 2 units of good 2, 1/2 labor per unit good 2. For the unit utility values, I denote them by the Greek letter mu. This says if 1 unit of x gives me 1 util of pleasure, then let me come back up here. If 1 unit of x gives me 1 util of pleasure, then the utility value is going to be 1 util per unit good 1, x1. If 2 units of x2 gives me 1 util of pleasure, then the marginal utility value of good 2 is going to be 1/2 a util per x2. Again, cut out the middleman. Both approaches are allow for us to explain this relationship here of the exchange between these different quantities of these different things. Okay, classical political economy develops the relationship by moving from labor value to money value. Here I developed this thing called the money expression of labor time. Really, that's a concept that was developed in that nomenclature. That word for the concept was developed in the literature that came out in the early 80s, 1982, by Duncan Foley and Gerard Dumenil, who independently looked at the relationship between the money value and the labor value, in this idea of the money expression of labor time. It's referred to as a new interpretation. Do note there is a lot of controversy on the transformation. I'll do a lesson on that and go through it. Here I'm just trying to keep it as simple as possible, and we assume that the MELT expresses the exchange between the labor value and the money form. And so by multiplying your labor value by your money expression of labor, then you're able to get your money prices. Okay, neoclassical economics, marginalist economics has to do the same thing. Here you have the money expression of utility. Now you don't hear about that much these days in economic theory, mostly because they moved away from the utility, the cardinal utility concept. But still, you do find it in Marshall. Okay, you will find the idea of the constant marginal utility of money. You'll find it in the work of Irving Fisher. You'll find the idea of moving from utility to money in some of the early neoclassical economists who are trying to grapple with these questions. So I encourage, and I'll link this up in subsequent lectures so that people can find it. Sraffa, for example, in some of his notes in the 1920s, specifically mentions the constant marginal utility of money, and how that informed the analysis, especially in Marshall. And so the point is that it's there conceptually. And so again, following the same, and I'm trying to keep the methodology the same, giving you the same methodological treatment for these two different theories here. Here you have the unit price of good 1 is going to be equal to the utility value times the money expression of utility for good 1 and good 2. And then here you can see that the same money price results. So the objective phenomena of $1 per good 1 and $0.50 per unit good 2 is explained using these different theoretical approaches. This is going to be kind of the sketch that I'm referring to. Okay, so this is my nonlinear sketch. In a sense, it's going to be a schism. Okay, you can see the schism happens in 1870. All right, so you have the historically earlier perspective, which is in classical political economy, or the cost of production theory of value. Value is going to be based on integrated production cost. I put up there William Petty, 1690, in Political Arithmetic. He does develop a rudimentary labor theory of value. I also have up there 1758, Francois Quesnay and the Physiocratic School of France. Strictly speaking, they're kind of earlier in terms of the more scientific understanding of this approach. Certainly for Quesnay, he didn't have a theory of value, or at least is commonly not thought to have a theory of value. Rather, what the physiocrats did, certainly what Quesnay did with the tableau économique, was he looked at the distribution relation, the circular flow relation in the classical context of a commodity model, right? A one commodity world approach. The Keynesian tableau économique is analytically on par with David Ricardo's Corn model from 1815. I'll talk more about that subsequently. But certainly by 1776, Adam Smith, an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations, Limitations, he begins to develop the labor theory of value and distribution, which we haven't forgotten, we're going to come to. 1798, Robert Malthus publishes his essay on the principle of population. They went into 5 editions, the last one being in 1817. 1815 is an incredibly important year for classical political economy. Here you had the development of the classical theory of rent, often referred to as Ricardian rent, but Ricardo was only one of the authors that published pamphlets on this question. You had Malthus, you had West, you had Torrens, and then you had Ricardo's essay on profits. And again, his essay on profits from 1815 is analytically on par, or can be made analytically on par with the Tableau économique of Quesnay, because of the fact that value is not dealt with there. 1817 to 1821 is when Ricardo published his 3 editions of his Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. The first edition was in 1817, the second edition was in 1819, and the third edition was in 1821. The major changes that happen in the subsequent editions, certainly by the third edition, was the changes in the chapter on value, which is the first chapter. Sraffa publishes, edited, and with collaboration of Maurice Daub, edited the 11-volume Works and Correspondence of David Ricardo. I have this here. We're going to talk about that in the next slide. We're very lucky to have the online Library of Liberty at Liberty Fund. It's really a free market-oriented website, kind of an Austrian theoretical website. Has put all of the Sraffa edition of Ricardo online. You can download the PDF. You can link up to the HTML version of it. They did a wonderful job. Thank you very much, Liberty Fund, for doing that. I think that that's a testament to their effort to bring out the scientific character of Ricardo's work, and it's also a testament to Sraffa's edition, because if you go on their website, you'll see, if you go to the name index and search up Sraffa, they call Sraffa a Marxist on that website, which I'm of course I don't have a problem with. But the point is that it's a testament to Sraffa's scholarship that an openly free market oriented website would still put up the Sraffa edition, even though they admit that Sraffa and Daub both were Marxists. So that's a testament to the objective scholarship of the Sraffa edition. I am very convinced that, with the exception of section 4 in the Introduction to Principles, volume 1, where Sraffa develops the corn theory of profits, with the exception of that section, which is interpretive and it's Sraffa's interpretation, everything else is a testament to objective scholarly research. Okay, that's my take on it, and I think that's evidenced by the fact that a free market website would put up the Sraffa because they recognize the scientific merit of the work, and props to them, and I mean that from the bottom of my heart. But we'll go there and we'll see, and we're going to completely utilize the Sraffa's edition of Ricardo. It's not been mined, in my opinion, since it's been published in 1951 to 1954. It's not really been properly mined, and we're going to do that now. And this is how we can unleash classical political economy. Boy, we got Sraffa to thank for a lot. Now it's the Prelude, and we're going to take it on. Okay. Malthus in 1820 writes his Principles of Political Economy. Remember, Ricardo wrote Principles 1 edition 1817, the second edition in 1819. Not that many changes, quite frankly, and Sraffa documents that. Malthus comes in 1820 with his Principles of Political Economy, and then Ricardo comes in with, Malthus comes in 1820, I should say, with his Principles of Political Economy, and Ricardo comes in with the third and final edition of his Principles in 1821 that had significant changes, some of which were based on the reading that Ricardo did of Malthus's Principles, and that's documented in the letters and in part in in volume 2 of the Sraffa edition precisely are Ricardo's notes on Malthus's principles of political economy. Really wonderful stuff that we have there. 1848, John Stuart Mill. When John Stuart Mill comes in, there's cracks in this labor theory of value window, and then you start to see the creeping of the demand and supply approach starts to come in. But 1860 to 1867 is where you have Marx come in. Now, Marx went the other way. All right, and what Marx said was, the subtitle to his tome, which is Capital or Das Kapital, the subtitle to Capital is a critique of political economy. All right, so what Marx does is he accepts certain elements of classical political economy, which, remember, was the scientific economics of its day. Right? Ricardo was on the stock market, made his fortune off the stock market. Malthus was a preacher in the Church of England, right? They were not radicals at all. They were the established part of English society and society in Britain at the time, right? And so what Marx comes in and says, you know what, I'm going to accept the labor theory value of the classical economists, and I'm going to take it a step further and solve, in my estimation, solve some of the quandaries that are associated therein. I have a paper that's coming out in an edited book by Louis-Philippe Brochon and Hassan Bourgoin. I'm probably butchering his name, but there they asked me to write an entry on Marx, and I go through and I try to show how where the critique of political economy that Marx is speaking about comes in, and how what Marx tried to do was solve the quandary that was happening in the classical labor theory of value from the 1820s and the 1830s, really with the Malthus-Ricardo exchange. I'll put a link of an earlier version up on there for people to be able to go through. But for our purposes here, the quandary in classical political economy amounts simply to this, that you had two different ways in which the labor theory of value was thought to be relevant. One was the way in which Ricardo conceived it, which was the notion of what we call labor bestowed or labor embodied. That's the idea of the labor theory of value that's most commonly known, where the labor bestowed value, or the labor embodied value is equal to the labor time congealed or contained in the commodity. All right? That was really kind of the Ricardian notion. Malthus took the idea of labor value and he said, well, bestow is an interesting relationship, but it's also the command, which is more important, coming from Smith. And in Smith, he had elements of both. Remember, Smith is kind of all over the place. And so there are elements of the bestow theory of value in Smith, and there's elements of the command theory of value in Smith, where the labor commanded idea considers the quantity of labor a commodity can command if we're in a market situation. Here, the distinction between value and capital comes in, because what Malthus says is simply this. He says to Ricardo, who's accepting the labor theory of value, okay, if labor time is going to be the source of the value of the commodities, what is the source of profit? And Malthus doesn't say it that way, but the question that we see amounts to that. Marx certainly says it that way, and said that, well, if labor time is going to be necessary for production, where's the profit come from? And what Malthus does is he identifies the quandary in Ricardo. He says to Ricardo, if I have a quantity of value as capital, the very fact that it's capital makes it command a quantity of value greater than itself. So how can you say that the labor theory of value holds? If the labor embodied theory of value holds. Because, as Malthus says, it's the labor that's commanded out there, not the labor that's bestowed. And so you see this quandary happen in the labor theory of value. Then you start having the Ricardian socialists start coming in around the 1830s and the 1840s and the 1850s. And they start to talk about the idea that profit comes from exploitation. This is what Marx picks up. So what Marx says is this, is okay, classical political economy, I can accept your premise that the value of commodities comes from the labor time it takes to produce it, and I'll up you one and say that the profit comes from the unpaid labor time that's associated with the fact that workers are paid less than their productivity. And so there you have what Marx calls the secret of profit making. It's in that essay that I have on Marx. So there you have the issue. right? Marx comes in and says, not only do I have a labor theory of value, I have an unpaid labor exploitation theory of profits. And this, of course, caused all sorts of controversy. Böhm-Bawerk, for example, wrote in the 1880s and the 1890s, developing specifically the criticism of Marx and the exploitation school of distribution. And so a lot of energy was developed in destroying the labor theory of value, as opposed to developing the contradictions that did exist. All right, it's almost like the baby was thrown out with the bathwater on this one, and that's what I argue Sraffa gave us, is he's able to have us come back and reconstruct this quandary that originally existed in the classical theory of value, and then move forward. But that's why this schism exists in 1870. All right, in 1867, Marx publishes the first edition of Capital. By 1870, I mean, it's like we weren't hearing that no more, right? And it's not individuals necessarily, but just the ready acceptance. Sraffa talks about this in the lecture notes on the advanced theory of value. The ready acceptance of the marginal utility theory of value, which was actually discovered as early as the 1830s by Dupuy, by Jules Dupuy, I'm probably butchering his name, by Gossin and by Cournot. Right, and this is what Sraffa speaks about in the lecture notes. He said in the 1830s and the 1840s they were developing a marginal theory of value, right? But they were considered to be cranks, and Sraffa calls them cranks. They were not scientific economists. They had these far-fetched ideas here. So Sraffa says, well, what is it in the span of of 50 years that made what was a crank theory back in the 1830s all the way by 1870? I said, well, that's accepted. And what Sraffa argues, and I agree with this perspective, it was the specter of Marx. 1870 comes, then you have the marginalist neoclassical approach. Again, very Monty Python-like. You had, oh, now for something completely different. Labor time no longer is going to be the basis of commodity. Stanley Jevons, in Theory of Political Economy, is very explicit in the preface of that book, where he says that Ricardo shunted economic theory on the wrong track with that erroneous labor theory of value. We need to reshunt it on the right track of marginal utility calculus in determining the relation between value and price and commensuration and distribution, etc. They didn't do distribution. Right? They only did value. Marginal productivity didn't come until 20 years later in the 1890s. That's another lesson we'll talk about. But the point is, you have that relationship here. Those are the three versions and the three founders I have here under it: Jevons, Walras, and Menger. Modern Austrian approaches, which do consider themselves heterodox and I think legitimately so, can argue that. And has some interesting developments there. I'll speak more about that in a subsequent lesson. But the modern Austrian approaches come from the Mengerian tradition of the neoclassical approach. So they're associated with the marginal economic tree. All right, so they may be heterodox, but they're not classical for sure. They come more from Menger and that approach, whereas modern heterodox economics comes out of the classical tradition. I have Keynes here in the general theory. Keynes also belongs, there's a line that should go up to the modern heterodox approaches there, so that Keynes can be given his due as being one of the founders of certainly the post-Keynesian approach that we have there. And then, of course, with Keynes, we have the micro and the macro distinction of what we have today. I'll come back and explain more of that, but that's generally the way that I understand it. So just to reiterate, all right, to kind of sum up here, classical political economy from the 1600s, really 1776, but given petty, we'll go there, to certainly 1870. Theory of value based on commensurate quantities of labor time necessary to produce the commodities. The primary unit of analysis is social aggregate macro level, and the agents are social actors such as classes and industry. So you have agency in classical political economy, but they're social agents. Neoclassical marginalist economics is from 1870 to the present. The theory of value is based on commensurate quantities of utility optimized at the margin of constrained choice. The primary unit of analysis is the disaggregate micro level, individual disaggregate micro level, and the agents here are individual actors such as consumers and firms. point here is that each theoretical perspective has the task of explaining the objective problem to be solved, namely how is it that different quantities of different heterogeneous things exchange for one another in non-capricious proportions which are observed in the market. And again, the non-capricious proportions is important here because we're not talking about an auction. Right? It's not a flea market, okay, where you haggle and then the prices are determined by caprice about what the buyer is willing to buy, to spend, and what the seller is willing to sell. And so you have that. That's not, you don't go to Walmart and haggle on that price, okay? You look at, you know, in the institutional context, of course, administered prices in the context of the labor theory of value or classical political economy, the production prices, etc. That's going to be happen there. Okay, you'll notice here that from the very idea of what constitutes the economy differs from the outset. Classical political economy considers the economy as a social construction and the unit of analysis at the macro-social level. The value relations turns on the objective conditions of production. Commensuration is based on quantities of labor time necessary to produce a unit of the commodity. Neoclassical marginalist economics considers the economy as an individual construction and the unit of analysis is at the micro-individual level. The value relation turns on the subjective conditions of utility maximization, and commensuration is based on quantities of subjective utility at the margin of constrained choice received from the consumption of a unit of the commodity. This is the end of this video. Okay, in the next video, we're going to come back and spend time specifically developing the classical political economy perspective. But this ends our first video, and we'll see you for the second. Okay, thanks a lot. Read on. Peace.